Okay, great.
Yep, I'll make the introduction. And before I do, we have folks from San Francisco, and it is the Elizabeth who knows John. So I'm Jerry Stengel. I'm the founder and president of Engineer, and I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on how nonprofits can thrive in changing times. And certainly the last couple of years have been changing, and not necessarily for the best. And John is going to take us through some of the research that he's been doing and highlight his book. But before we turn over the reins to John, just a couple of housekeeping details. John is going to pause periodically to take your questions, so anytime you have a question, just type it in to the chat box in the lower right-hand corner, and I'm going to be your voice and ask John the questions. And I want to remind everybody that we will be sending the recording and the slides afterwards. It takes usually about 24 hours before we do that. And I want to introduce John, who is a colleague and a friend of mine, and really a delight to have on of Engineer webinar. He is a nationally recognized expert in executive leadership, nonprofit effectiveness and sustainability, and in assisting them in their growth and decline stages. John's an adjunct professor. He's a popular blogger at Stanford Social Innovation Fund. And he is also an author, and he's just written a book called Building Nonprofit Capacity, Strategic Tools for Managing Change. I'm going to turn it over to you, John.
Great. Well, Jerry, first of all, thank you so much for hosting these and for having me on here. I think I've known you for some time, but it's been great to see the work that you've been doing and also the growth of Engineer, which is awesome. So I'm just going to talk about some things that I've been seeing both in the sector and talking a little bit or a lot about the themes that are part of my book. And so I'm going to dive into that. I'm going to stop every couple of slides for questions, but you're certainly, in the chat, if there's something that comes up, please. I think I'm able to have my eyes on multiple places, so please don't hesitate to say, John, what does that mean? And I'll try to address that as we move forward. Otherwise than that, again, thank you all for staying on the line, and I look forward to our time together. All right, so the two things that I'm going to talk about today is the first one, my book, which is entitled Building Nonprofit Capacity, which was put out by Josie Bass Publishers in the fall of last year, and essentially looks at organizations in a variety of different ways. And so I'm going to talk about a lot about the themes from the book and how it might apply to your work in the nonprofit sector. And then finally, I think I'm going to talk about where I've spent a lot of my time over the last several years as I finished my doctorate on the government's relationship to the nonprofit sector, both in the area of making sure that those that are nonprofit leaders understand policy dynamics a little bit and understanding where government is going, because I think it's important for sector leaders to kind of understand that momentum a little bit so that they can plan strategically for themselves as they move forward. So those are kind of the two areas that I'm going to talk about specifically. The first area that I'm going to talk about first is the book Building Nonprofit Capacity, which the screenshot in front of you is a screenshot of the book, which not to plug, but you can get on Amazon. So, but there's a couple of reasons. I wrote it with a colleague of mine, Ann Sherman, who is the vice president of the Growth Philanthropy Network, and spent the last 12 years at the TCC Group in New York City, which is a consulting firm that works with both philanthropies and nonprofits. And so both of us, by current practice, are recent practice for Aon have been nonprofit consultants, but both of us have spent a considerable amount of time with hundreds of nonprofits throughout the country, kind of looking at them and helping them build their capacity. And so what we found in our work was that there was obviously a lot of books about the nonprofit sector, but there was really nothing out there that helped nonprofit leaders kind of anticipate and manage change, right? So it talked about indicators of change, but not necessarily helping them kind of understand how they could get out in front of change rather than be kind of quote-unquote victims of change or let change happen to them. The second one is helping nonprofits as they think about strategy. And what we found is that lots of times there were lots of nonprofits spending a considerable amount of time on nonprofit strategic planning efforts in siloed ways and not approaching strategy, and so in a way that we thought was very helpful. So for us, we hoped that this book can be a useful tool to help nonprofits think strategically, think different about their approach to strategy. And so those were the first two focuses. So I'm going to actually, let me go back. There we go. So there's a way of looking at nonprofits in a number of different ways. One of the ways that I think is useful is a model that was actually developed by this TCC group that looks at organizations in three different ways, right? And so organizations can be looked upon as, number one, how do they relate to their external environment, right? So this is a model about the three different kind of focuses of nonprofits, and that organizations that are focusing on these areas in some way, shape, or form, usually are organizations that are moving towards impact in a way that organizations who don't focus on these areas are not. So one of the ways that organizations are focusing on impact is first by focusing specifically on their external environment, and that means looking at what's going on in terms of social and demographic forces within their community, what's going on in terms of the political and regulatory focuses. So when a government makes decisions at the statewide level in relation to, if I'm looking at, the homeless issues in Toronto, Canada, for instance, and the government is making decisions about what's going on in relation to homeless services, that I understand those decisions and how those movements are going to be affecting my nonprofit now or 5 years from now. And so nonprofits that are high impact have a good understanding and feel for what's happening in political and regulatory forces. Of course, obviously, over the last couple of years, what's going on economically, and that organizations that are able to kind of not only read the tea leaves, but kind of plan around what's going on economically are the ones that are going to have more success. And then finally, organizations that see different kind of societal technological forces happening, whether it's a larger pull into social media or a variety of different kind of platforms that are being used. High-impact nonprofits are ones that kind of understand those different technological forces and are able to plan around them. So external environment is one of the areas that nonprofits, those that are high impact, are focusing on all of these areas. The second one is how organizations are spending and using their resources specifically, right? So to the left, there's facilities. If your organization's lucky enough to have facilities or is renting facilities, the idea is that they're using those facilities in the greatest way they can, managing their time. I don't think anybody on the phone, most of the times I ask this, would say that they have enough time in the day to be able to do everything that they need to do, but those organizations that are able to kind of most effectively manage their time, I oftentimes see the organizations that have the ability to say no and use their time as a currency to say, I'm going to do the work with my time towards this and not get pulled into time sucks that take me away from our core mission. The third area is finances and funding, and that doesn't mean just fundraising, but it means that you're using your budget allocations in the most effective way possible, right? So that you understand where your money's coming in and you're using that money in the most creative and meaningful way. The other area, switching to the other side, is program design and your model, right? So, my consulting firm spends a considerable amount of time. One of the kind of four bucket areas that we work in pretty specifically is with organizations that are in organizational decline or in collapse. And oftentimes we see one of the leading reasons that these organizations found themselves in real serious difficulty was because their program model had become stale. For instance, if they ran an after-school program, their after-school program looked like every other after-school program in their community or whatever the case may be. And a high-impact organization is one that is consistently kind of looking at their program design and making sure that it meets the needs and its mission meets the needs of the communities that they're serving. The next area is technology, and that means that does the organization have the right computers and all of the kind of technological areas and tools and resources they need to be effective. And then the final one, which I actually think is the most important, 80% of money spent in the nonprofit world is spent on people, and so that's the money that is spent in the human resource / human capital world. So are you utilizing your people correctly? Are the individuals that you have that you're paying or that are volunteering, are they being utilized to their ultimate capabilities? And so that's the resources section. The final kind of center circle is how is the organization managing itself as an organization, and there's 4 areas that look at that pretty specifically. So the first one is, does the organization have an ability to adapt? Does it strategically plan for itself? Is it agile and is able to kind of move based on what's going on within the organization? The management capacity is the organization managing that center wrong, the resources section well? Is it using organizational resources efficiently and effectively? Does across the ways, the leadership capacity, is the leader inspiring? Is the leader visionary, making decisions? Does the organization feel like it's innovating in the respective areas that it's in? And then finally, the organizational technical capacity. Does the organization have the ability to all of the things that make up the organization's kind of technical ability to do its work? Does it have fundraising capacity? Can it market itself? All of that kind of area. So this slide is not to say that organizations need to do all of these at 100%. What this slide is basically saying is that high-impact organizations are ones that recognize that these are essential areas of organizational development and that it has plans and is working towards all of these different areas in some way, shape, or form. So the book is centered around the basic kind of model, what we call the nonprofit life cycle. And so the nonprofit life cycle is a model that kind of all organizations go through a different stage in the nonprofit life cycle. And so we found in our work in talking with organizations that the nonprofit life cycle was the kind of the best framework to help organizations immediately kind of cite where they were and what that meant. So we thought that, the first point is that the life cycle was a great way to outline the stages that exist within a nonprofit organization. I'm going to show you a life cycle in a second. It was a good tool to kind of provide patterns and predictability about where the organization is and where it's going. It immediately helped organizations understand where they were within the life cycle and establish buy-in. So if organizations felt that they were in growth, for instance, if the executive director felt that the organization was in growth but the board thought differently, that conversation was a valuable conversation to have that often many nonprofits don't ever get to. And so we felt that, just getting into the life cycle discussion was a way to kind of get buy-in to where the organization was. It also was a good way to kind of depersonalize issues and challenges, right? So if you were talking specifically about where you were on the life cycle, it could take an individual's name. If a founder was there, it might take the founder's name out of it and immediately put talking about the organization on the life cycle rather than personalizing it or things of that nature. It allowed organizations to kind of measure their capacity and their improvement towards capacity over time. It talked and normalized kind of and talked about kind of what were the challenges that they are seeing or going. The life cycle was a good way to kind of say, okay, this is where we are in the life cycle. What do we need to do to move forward in the right way? Or if you were in decline, what is the way that we can deal with decline and move out of decline and into a better area? in a better way. And so it allowed organizations to kind of set themselves on a trajectory. I'm going to explain this slide, and then I'll stop. I'll stop and ask questions. Although if you have any questions, please feel free to kind of type them out in the chat. So the life cycle was created in the early 70s as a kind of a business model that came out of the Harvard Business Review. And so it largely was a for-profit model that existed for some time. But in the middle of the 90s, Susan Kenny Stevens was an author that wrote about the nonprofit life cycle, the life cycle in terms of nonprofits. Actually, two books from two different authors came out at pretty much the same time talking about the life cycle, and both authors, coincidentally enough, came from the Minneapolis area from where I'm from, so I don't know if it's in our water in Minneapolis to talk about life cycle. But in any sense, the Stephen model, what you see before you, essentially talks about organizations in 6 or 7 different kinds of areas, right? So all organizations find themselves at one point in time as an idea, right? I don't know how many people on the phone are founders, but if you're a founder, there was a time in which you were sitting at your kitchen table and you were saying, you know what, here's an issue in my community, or here's something that needs to be started, and I'm going to start it. And so largely the idea phase is the phase in which ideas become organizations, right? So, and the idea phase can last a long time. You know, somebody can be tinkering with an idea for a really long time, and then ultimately decide to start a nonprofit after many years of thinking about it. But ultimately, the idea stage moves into startup, where the organization becomes more real. The individual says, let me grab a couple of my friends, let's start to think about how we can work on these programs and how we can get to resources. And so organizations start to form and gel, and out of what could be a really lengthy or actually a really short period of idea quickly moves into to a startup phase. Most startup phase can usually last within around the 2 to 3 year mark. Organizations, and if the organization, 80% of nonprofits actually, when they move from idea to startup, don't make it past startup, right? So it's really hard to get an idea to move past startup and into growth, but those that do find themselves in startup in a very short period of time, again around 2 to 3 years. So startup includes really starting to deliver a service or services on the ground, starting to raise dollars, starting to form a board, and usually those boards are 1 degree connected to the founder. And once that idea and the project becomes really real, and the individuals in the community or funders are interested in this, and it gains some momentum, it quickly enters a growth phase, right? And we'll talk a little bit about different types of growth, but at least right now, growth phase can last anywhere from 7 to 10 years, right? And so growth really means resources are being gained towards programs. Programs are targeted or expanding towards a certain level. It's usually still the board is still 1 to 2 degrees connected to the founder. There's some momentum behind it, and so it usually seems like a period in which yes is said more than no, right? There becomes a time after several years of growth in which people start to say, I'm tired of growing, right? And so what starts to happen is the organization hopefully starts to say, well, we're not going to start adding any new programs, or we're going to kind of develop some systems and processes and start to kind of slow our growth down. And what you inevitably start to see is a maturity in the organization, and maturity phase statistically can last a really long time. It can even last up to 30 years, but it's a time in which the organization starts to flatten out its growth. You can still maybe, smart growth can be a little bit, but largely the organization's developing systems and procedures and policies, and those in growth, staff members in growth you might know by name. In maturity phase, those staff members are known by positions, right? And so you start to see kind of a formalizing of the organization. Board policies and procedures start to take place, things like that. Funding relationships start to be obviously really long-term. And so maturity starts to set in, and again, that can happen over a long period of time. What ends up happening during this time is nobody knowingly enters decline and says, hey, you know what, I think declining is a really good idea. Let's start to decline. But decline starts to happen in maturity phase because programs in this phase start to become stale. The board and leadership can become complacent. Your program design can become moot. Right, there can be other or other organizations in the community can kind of take over your place, and so the organization inevitably can enter decline. And so in the decline phase, what you start to see is sometimes if it's a founder, the founder will leave, right? A lot of founders are those individuals that really like to create, right? But decline is something that they're not really, is an exciting proposition for them. So you might find that an organizational leader may leave during this time. You might also see the board members who really liked the growth phase. Being a board member during growth can be really exciting. Being a board member during decline cannot be as exciting, right? Certain responsibilities and things like that can be asked of board members that they were never asked of before. You can start to see funding start to move away, funders start to move other places, things like that. And so you can start to enter through decline. And what you'll see on decline is you'll see that dotted line. In the book, we talk about the meeting of that dotted line as the apex point, where pretty much the organization has 3 decisions to make. It can make one decision to say, you know what, we're declining and we're going to close the organization down. And there's 2 ways to do an organizational close. You can sunset, right, and close gracefully, or you can close ungracefully and, just do a lot of things wrong. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Organization can go out, expand away from the dotted line and do a merge. And there's a variety of different ways of merging that the organization can do. Or the organization, which most of the time happens, can make a decision to turn itself around. And in the turnaround phase, that's the whole dotted line phase. The purpose of turnaround is to turn yourself around back into a growth section, right? And so organizational turnaround, we talk about in the book as a real organizational DNA change. An organization is going to be moving themselves from point 1.0 to point 2.0 and is really going to be changing a variety of different things. That's not to say that it's going to go from community gardening to bike maintenance, but it's going to be changing a variety of the makeup of the organization, and that would be the turnaround process. So, and then there's terminal, which means the organization is closing. So those are the various kind of phases of the Stevens model. I'm going to stop really quickly and just see if there's anybody has any questions. It'd also be helpful if anybody knew or felt comfortable kind of saying where they felt their organization might be on the nonprofit life cycle.
So I actually just took the words out of my mouth. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do, and this can be sort of anonymous, is just above your slides, there's a little person with a hand up. If you can raise your hand if you're in startup, and just say yes.
All right.
So we have two people in startup. Okay, if you can unraise your hand, and let me see if I can dismiss everybody from that.
Yeah, I probably
Everybody can unraise their hands who've just raised their hands.
There we
How
go.
many of you are in growth stage? Raise your hands. So we have a shy audience, 2 people, 3 people. Okay, unraise your hands, lower your hands. How about maturity? How many of you are mature? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We've got lots of people in maturity. Okay, so far that's the winner. Lower your hands. How many of you are in decline?
That's sometimes the hardest one to admit. Right?
Yeah, I bet. So 3 people in decline. If you can lower your hands. How many are you in, if the decline people can lower their hands, and the turnaround people raise their hands?
Anybody in turnaround? Great.
1 in 2 in turnaround.
Right.
4.
All right.
And then lower your hands, and anybody in terminal who is terminal, rather.
Yeah.
Okay, so one terminal.
Great.
So it doesn't look like we have any questions, but that helps you, John, shape, I guess, the presentation.
Sure.
So
No,
most
that's really
everybody, yeah, which is exactly what the bell-shaped curve shows. Most people are in mature stage.
good. Good. That's awesome. So, and again, it usually is the longest period, so it makes sense why people would be there. Now, I would say just for people that are in the maturity phase, the things to watch out for, the things to really plan for, are to make sure, number one, that you're really evaluating your programs, that you are really looking for upstart and best practices in the industry. I think lots of paying attention to, at least within your section, if you're paying, if you're the Tides group in San Francisco, you're paying attention to your industry and what people are doing and making sure that, because in maturity you can become stale, right? Or in maturity your board can become stale. So if I'm Melissa at Tides, I'm going to pay attention to making sure that my board members are ultra engaged, right, or something of that nature. So there's a variety of things that in the maturity phase you want to make sure. Now everyone should know that everyone goes through all of these phases. When you say the word decline, most of the times people are, they think of really horrendous things. But decline doesn't have to be a really challenging place. It can just be, you're entering as an organization at a time in which you have to recalibrate yourselves, right? You understand that the funding is different in your area, right? Or that there's a variety of different kind of changes in the external environment that are affecting your industry. Like community action agencies, right, which are in 96% of the counties in the country, are really going through some real industry changes. Most community action agencies probably find themselves in decline, whether they like it or not, and many of them that are successful will find themselves kind of recalibrating during the decline phase, shedding some of the challenges that they have, and then really moving through turnaround so that they can enter as an organization that's really entering the community in a new dynamic entity. So let me move on to the next slide. So the TCC group also has a kind of a life cycle pyramid in which they basically say that there is no real decline, right? And so me and Ann, who worked at TCC, had lots of really good dialogue around this, but they basically said that there's three kind of phases that organizations are in, and the base level kind of program phase is what they call core program, which means that the organization's consistently working on making sure that there's really close alignment between programs and between mission and vision, and really making sure that there's clarity in the organization as it relates to those two. Organizations that have real clarity between programs and mission and vision and do that well find themselves moving into what they call infrastructure development, where the organization needs to develop further systems to help itself operate more smoothly, creating policies and procedures and good communication between staff. Largely infrastructure development, as you'll see on the next slide, looks quasi-equivalent to what's happening at the end of growth and the beginning of maturity. And then finally, the organization where TCC is going is that there is no decline, that there's a consistent kind of hamster wheel that the organization's moving into impact expansion that's consistently kind of deepening alliances, developing partnerships, different areas, that is working and becoming what they call policy and advocacy leaders within their respective areas. And organizations can find themselves, moving within these three, but all organizations at their core are working on what they call core program development. So if you look at kind of how these relate to each other, you can see that here's an integrated kind of way to look at it. So within the book, what we basically, when we would meet with nonprofit leaders and talk about the life cycle, what I typically ended up hearing frequently was, yes, the life cycle is kind of helpful, but it doesn't necessarily specifically explain exactly where I am, right? And so, and again, no model is ultimately ever, you don't put yourself to a model and say that's exactly what we are, but what we try to do at least, is try to take a model and advance it so that it can become more applicable to nonprofits out there. And so one of the ways that I saw was that I found that organizations within the life science framework were either what we call low-arc nonprofits or high-arc nonprofits. Low-arc nonprofits are nonprofits that are usually long-serving nonprofits that have, you can go through the life cycle multiple times in your history. Low-arc organizations are those that have gone through the life cycle model a couple of times, that they usually have larger budgets, and that change happens typically slower than most nonprofits, right? So that if you were going through a growth phase, that growth phase for the Museum of Natural History here in New York City, or with the with the March of Dimes nationally or whatever, change is going to happen most likely very slowly, right? And so when you're thinking strategically about the organization, you're planning strategically for low-arc organizations, you're creating a strategic plan that understands that the organization is going to be moving slowly wherever it deems itself. We also found that there were organizations, and this is a much larger group of organizations, because the majority of nonprofits in the United States find themselves as small to mid-sized groups, right? Not necessarily having huge budgets. And so we found that many of these
John,
organizations...
if you could just describe what a small organization would be and a mid-size.
A mid-size might be $5 million or under, right? Somewhere in that range. Most organizations are not and there's actually good data out right now that just came out by Bridgespan that talks about many of the large nonprofits are getting larger, but the number of small to mid-size are staying the same. So there's still a lot of small to mid-sized nonprofits, but more resources, it seems, as of late, are going to larger organizations. But when I'm talking about mid-sized to small, it's mid-sized in the 5 million range, with lots of smaller groups at the $1 million or under range, or even $500,000 or under. And so growth and decline within these you can have what you call really high arc growth. And if anybody remembers, 7th grade science or 9th grade science, somewhere in there, depending on where you went, you could have it's slope, right? Slope is the growth versus the time. And so you could have really high growth, a large number of resources given to the organization in a very short amount of time. And then decline is the same way. You could have a loss of resources in a short amount of time, right? And so what we found is the publisher used this kind of artwork within the book, but what we're finding, at least in the economic crisis, is actually high-arc organizations could even resemble what we call a pencil, where organizations have really high growth, no maintain phase, and really sharp decline, right? And so, which can make, the maintain phase is the time in the organization's life in which you kind of, organize yourself, get yourself together. They follow many similar kind of personal arcs of people personally, right? You can have really rapid, things can go really crazy for you, and you use your 30s to kind of say, all right, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to get stuff together. And so so within this model, what we're finding is lots of organizations, including we're seeing, at least my firm is seeing a lot of now social blank groups is what I call it in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, but social entrepreneurship, social innovation groups that have gained a lot of revenue really quickly, now all of a sudden coming to my firm to say, hey, we're entering decline. And what's ended up happening to those groups is that they did not build.
So we seem to have lost John on the voice. Let me send John and I'm going to check to make sure. Okay, so I'm on. We've lost John. Let me just email him, or not email, but so I'm just typing to John that we've lost his audio. And I'm going to email him as well. And then I will also call him. So I'm going to ask him to redial in. Okay, so let's just see if we can get John. And the next thing is to call John. So technology sometimes doesn't work smoothly, and I apologize. Just to make sure that he's there. So if everybody else can just type in and let me know that they're hearing me. Okay, so we can hear me, but we can't hear John. So I am still trying to get John, and let me just get his phone number. Okay. So again, I'm just dialing John on my cell to let you know where we are. Okay. Okay, thanks. Bye. So John is logging back on. He will be with us momentarily. In the meantime, I am going to turn back on the chat function, or not the chat function, the audio so I can hear when John does it, when he's back in. So I'm going to unmute everybody.
Sorry about that.
Okay, John, so I'm going to mute everybody again. It's technology, stuff happens. I'm going to mute everybody and then ask you to press star pound. So give me a second to mute everybody.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Press star pound.
All right, here we go. Sorry about that, everyone. My internet just went collapsed here in the middle of New York City. My apologies. Can everyone hear me now?
I can.
Good. All right. So we ended on the hierarch model. So I would be interested as we are coming back, and again, I'll keep talking while you write, but I'd be interested to know if your organization was either hierarch or lowarch.
So should we up? Okay.
Yeah,
So
just type it in. Yeah, lowarch. All right. So we have a mix with a lot of hierarchs and lowarchs. So I think if you can, as an organization, if you can think about where you're at. Now imagine you're approaching two of the points we make in the book. And the first point is, imagine you're approaching strategy. And as an organization approaching strategy, number one, you're able to pinpoint within the life cycle. And this is done through assessment. But in an assessment, you're able to kind of pinpoint where you are in the life cycle. And we asked you earlier how many of you are in growth and maintain or whatever the case may be. Many of you pointed to either maintain or turnaround, right? So if you're a hierarch, right? So if you're in maintain and a hierarch, that means you're either going to try to stave off potential decline, or you're going to try to maintain growth growth and minimize what potentially is going to happen in decline. And so your strategic plan in growth is much different than strategic planning in maintain, is much different than strategic planning in decline, and it's much different for low arc and it's much different for high arc. And so our basic premise is that organizations, when they approach strategy, some of the things they need to think about in terms of where they are strategically is, number one, where they are in the life cycle, and two, what type of arc they have within an organization. The final thing is, and what we noticed in organizations, is that oftentimes nonprofits, when they think strategically in terms of very siloed time, right? So they're going to say, hey, next January, we're going to start our strategic planning process, we're going to be done in June, and then we're set, right? And that's kind of the equal of somebody in the beginning of the year saying, I'm going to work out I'm going to work out. They never worked out before, and then all of a sudden thinking that they're going to maintain a healthy regimen of getting in shape. Strategy is an ongoing and everyday thing that an organization needs to be embarked in, and so boards, I go to 3 board meetings a week, and I frequently find that most boards never get to strategy. Strategy is something that organizations need to commit to themselves to doing on an areas that you're working on within the organization. So you'll see within the book there are tools and resources to kind of help nonprofits, and we have a dashboarding tool that I've used with a variety of organizations that helps organizations take strategy and make sure that it's operationalized within the organization, and that it touches down all the way to human capital, making sure that strategic plans touch job descriptions, right? If you're spending 80% of your money on average on people, your strategic plan should be reflected in your individual's job descriptions and the way that their work is being targeted. So those are 2 areas that we cited pretty specifically. One, using kind of the high arc, low arc, and using the life cycle as a way to kind of think about your strategy, and then second, making sure that strategy is something that's an ongoing muscle that you're using and not a siloed effort that's done and that's not followed. The next area that we wanted to focus on, Jerry, I'm having trouble changing my slide here. Can you move my slide for me? There we go. And the next one after this is talking about the government and the nonprofit sector. And so we're talking about it in terms of areas that oftentimes we find, or I found in my dissertation work, is that lots of nonprofit leaders, we went out and surveyed hundreds of nonprofit leaders throughout the country and asked them about policy relating to their issue area of their nonprofit. What I found is that largely many nonprofit leaders were vastly unaware of the policy changes that were going on in their respective area. And so one of the things that I talk about in the dissertation, and this is actually going to be the second book, we're creating a handbook for nonprofit leaders and for students that talks about the relationship between government and nonprofit, and one of the areas that we're going to focus on is nonprofit policy. But essentially, if I, like Elizabeth Wolf, who is a leader in the breast cancer world, if I am Elizabeth Wolf, I'm going to be focusing on what's going on in terms of popular culture and media as it relates to breast cancer, and what's going on in terms of the historical relationship between breast cancer and government or policies that relate to that. What's going on in terms of the federal government working, or state government, or whatever governmental entity, in implementing any policies or laws that relates to breast cancer. And what that's going to do for me as an organization is going to help me, number one, understand where I need to go strategically, but number two, potentially make me a better policy advocate. And so we think that, in my research, found that, again, many nonprofits were just vastly unprepared to kind of talk about or advocate on behalf of the issues within their community. And I understand, I've been an executive director of a nonprofit and know that that's some of the hardest work in the world. You're out raising money all the way to changing toilet paper rings, and you're doing everything in between. But one of the most important things is that government is becoming increasingly involved in this sector. Policy is becoming more of a dynamic that's involved in in our work, and that nonprofit leaders or people that are involved in the nonprofit sector need to know, number one, what the policies and laws that affect their issue area, and then how is popular culture changing or working with that law? What is the historical relationship of that law? And then finally, how is that law implemented? And the more high-impact nonprofits understand the policy dynamics are ones that are able to, number one, be real change agents on behalf of that policy, but two, are the ones that are able to strategically plan for themselves around what's going on in that policy and take advantage and not let policy changes impact them beyond their control. Jerry, the next slide would be great. All right, and then the final thing is what we're seeing is that, or what I saw is that higher education in the sector is playing a larger role. 10 years ago, we saw a handful of MPA or nonprofit certificate programs. And now what we see is they're everywhere. And so the idea of what's going on with higher education, public universities and nonprofits and things of that nature is really important. I think the second thing is that we're seeing a real, emergence of private sector businesses and corporations doing public good and creating nonprofit infrastructure to be able to do that, whether they're creating foundations or whether you're seeing B3s or things of that nature. What you're starting to see is, and this relates to the next tax and legal changes, people finding that the nonprofit tax code is limiting, and so therefore you going outside of that and creating social enterprises and things of that nature to be able to do the work that they need to do. And I think that's important for nonprofits to understand. I think within finally understanding where there's regulation coming from the nonprofit sector, which I think is really important, understanding that government is moving towards, that's not only the Social Innovation Fund and other areas, looking towards impact and return on investment, although they're not calling it ROI. And I think organizations that have been largely not involved and haven't seen this should know, and are heavily government funded should know, be looking to the foundation community and seeing how that movement has happened and how that's going to transfer over to government. So a good example is, again, the Community Action was the only government program highlighted in the last Obama address, and basically is going to be cut somewhat, but also within those cuts, the money is going to be
Okay, it looks like we lost John again. I am going to unmute.
laws relating to nonprofits' ability to
John, we lost you. John, we lost you for a second.
And then nonprofits having the understanding that government contracting is largely not 3 months more or late, and being able to plan around that is really important. Can you all hear me still?
Yes.
Okay.
It faded out for a moment, but you're back now.
Okay. So anyway, so that's kind of my presentation. What I'd like to do is just get any questions that you might have. We have like 10 minutes remaining, but I'd love to be able to answer any questions, comments, or any areas that you think I might be able to be helpful. I think my contact information and other information's on the next slide.
Okay, so I guess you need me to forward that. Okay, questions.
There you go.
Great. So while we're waiting for people to write in their questions, can you talk a little bit about who might be funding sort of this capacity building of, people going back to school or doing a strategic planning process or a business planning process or going through a scaling process? How does a nonprofit find the money and resources to think through these kinds of strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that it's only foundations, but there is a movement or a growth in the number of foundations out there that are funding capacity building, and so that's certainly one place. We're also starting to see a number of government funds being used towards the building of capacity as well, which is relatively new. So you look at a federal organization like the Corporation for National and Community Service, which has been funding organizations to provide capacity building to its grantees. My consulting firm's largest contractor is the federal government, and our work largely is working with government grantees around capacity building. So it's something that the language of capacity building is something that's obviously becoming more and more part of the kind of nonprofit vernacular. It's been for a number of years, but the funding is following suit. So I think foundations and government are increasingly getting more and more involved in that. I only point to the changes in nonprofit education to point to also, we're going to see, if anybody's paying attention to where nonprofit leadership is going, there's going to be, or has started to be, kind of the baby boomer executives of the nonprofit sector are starting to leave their posts, having stayed on during the economic crisis. And so I think the education community is seeing that that there's going to be this gap, and so therefore trying to train and educate the next generation of leaders. And so therefore I think it's important to understand that if as an organization, if I'm leading it and I have a good middle management group but is not educated in the nonprofit sector, I might think about ways as the organization to help promote ways for them to get nonprofit certificates or try to go to school and things of that nature, because what's going to end up happening is you're either going to lose them, they're going to bounce into other organizations or other efforts.
So sort of interesting times that we live in. Off the top of your head, could you name some of either the foundations that are beginning to step up to the plate for capacity building, and do they do it within certain sectors, or is it across the board?
I mean, I think it's across the board. I'm happy if anybody on the phone wants to email me directly. I'm happy to send them a free funding study that kind of talks about capacity builders, funders within their area. That's easy for us to do. But I think, largely those capacity building funders are in every community throughout the country, and it's actually growing in other areas of the world. So I've been, just traveled to Australia and Northern Ireland, the UK, throughout Canada, and I think capacity building is also part of the general discussion points in those areas and other areas as well.
Okay. And you talked about, the transition that's really going to be happening over the next year, not year, but several years from nonprofits who are headed by baby boomers. And I know you specialize in these kinds of transitions, and we both know other people that do as well. Can you talk a little bit about maybe interim EDs and what purpose they might have during these transitions?
Sure. So interim executive leadership is actually a relatively new phenomenon in the nonprofit sector, having gone on for several years. But in comparison to just a strictly nonprofit executive search, it's a baby. But essentially, there's a group of individuals about 10 years ago, although the practice has kind of been done in other segments, that started to develop this practice called interim executive leadership, that when an organization lost their leader, they would place an interim executive in its place rather than to rehire somebody brand new, and that during that time, the organization, while having the interim executive leader, could both kind of recalibrate where it's going, think real strategically about the next leader that they're going to have, really plot the organization's direction, and bring on a new leader, and then also onboard them in the right way so that the organization leader could be both successful and the organization could find the right person. So that's a growing kind of effort, and it's actually growing pretty rapidly where many cities across the United States at least, and other places around the country are now believe that interim executive leadership, that practice is more valuable and can be more beneficial for the organization than organizations that immediately go to search. And so you contrast that versus what's happening in the starting or is going on in the sector in terms of executive leadership leaving baby boomers and there's supposed to be a 60 to 70, depending on who you read, 70% turnover in executive leadership in the States, with only 20% of those individuals wanting new positions. And so that is a pretty big gap of new leadership. And so when organizations engage with interim executive leadership, they can find success in any number of ways, including more funding, more secure systems, and a better board, a variety of different things that would have been missed if they just did search. So it looks like even somebody on the chat has used interim executive leadership, and it's, again, a practice that is growing and should be taken advantage of, especially with the growth of the number of executive openings going to be happening over the next several years.
So I know both of us know here in New York the resources that are available, but for finding interim executives, could you talk, like in a local market, how you might, find an interim executive director?
Sure. I think there's a great national organization that focuses on capacity building, but also has I used to chair this group a couple years ago. It has an affinity group of interim executive leaders called the Alliance for Nonprofit Management. And so if you do just a Google search on it, I think it's allianceonline.org, they have an affinity group that is of people all over the country that work on this work. So if you go to that website, email the individual there and say you're looking for somebody in wherever, then I think you'll be able to find somebody. The support center has trained over 300 individuals to be interim executive leaders. We've actually meshed our interim executive leaders with turnaround specialists. So individuals that are, most times we find organizations that are in interim leadership positions are organizations that are in the decline part of the life cycle, and so we have also trained them to be turnaround specialists. And so, but I think if you go to the Alliance for Nonprofit Management, that's a good executive leader networks in your communities.
Okay. So it doesn't look like we have any questions, but before we say goodbye, I did not say the name of your organization, and I may be mispronouncing it. Is it Quidoo? And could you tell us what it stands for, what it means?
Sure, yeah. So Quidoo Consulting is an organization that I started in 1997. And so it's been around 15 years, and essentially we do a variety of different things, including organizational turnaround, and we do a lot of system building, helping organizations either rebuild their HR or development shops or program evaluation or things like that. And then we do fundraising, which is how we really started, but do a lot of organizational turnaround and board coaching and executive coaching and things like that. So lots of capacity building, which is the nature of the book, of course. So.
Excellent. And if you can remind everybody about the name of your book and where they might be able to find it.
Sure. So the book is called Building Nonprofit Capacity. You can find it on Amazon. And any questions that anybody has about whether it's the book or things that we touched upon, you can feel free to email me at the email now or 5 years from now. Of course, our organization provides lots of pro bono services out to the community. We have a grant program in which we do this work, and so we just love building capacity, and if we could do it for free, we would, but we do a lot of it for free anyway. So we're happy to answer questions or send resources or things of that nature, and look forward to connecting with some of you if that's the case.
Terrific. And, having selected a capacity builder and in more specifically a fundraiser for a nonprofit, I went through a process and chose John. So I definitely recommend John, and he's wrapping up on the process for our nonprofit. So and he did a fabulous job. And I want to tell everybody about some upcoming webinars that we have. One is by John Corwin, who John Brothers knows, and it really is going to be about nonprofit executive transition. He's going to be talking about how to manage it, and that's going to be on May 17th. We're also going to be doing best practices in email marketing for small businesses and nonprofits. Vengineer, excuse me, I had a cold and I'm still fighting with my voice as to when it's going to fade in and out. Vengineer just finished fielding a survey on online marketing habits, which include social media, email, search engine marketing and everything else, and really some fascinating results and the ability to compare nonprofits to small businesses. So much to my surprise, nonprofits actually start using social media sooner than small businesses and then fall behind, and they fall behind because of time constraints. So, you know that better than me because you've got so many things that you're